Friends, okay, I have an important question for you. When you are suffering, do you suffer joyfully or do you fall into self-pity and despair? If you're anything like me, it's probably 90% the latter and maybe like 10% the former. Well, I read this quote by Theodore Maynard, who is a famous poet and historian of Roman Catholicism, and I'm shook. He said, "And I think Christ laughed when they took him with staves the night before he died." Wait, excuse me? Christ did what? He laughed? I read that while reading this book of letters from John Paul I. Now, this pope, my favorite pope, was only pope for 33 days. He knew he wasn't going to be pope for a very long time, and as a matter of fact, he knew who would be the pope after him. But he made such an impact in the world because he was so joyful. That's what people remember him for, his smile. It says in the foreword of this book that his smile broke through the defeatism that seemed to be the source of the sourness afflicting so many of that generation. The foreword goes on to explaining that the joy wasn't insensible to the hurt and the suffering going on in the world because it was the joy of Jesus crucified. How is Jesus' crucifixion joyful? Well, I might as well read this entire foreword, but I won't. I'll just read a short part. It says, "Certainly St. Thomas More was no fool when he joked about his own death. He could afford to be joyful because he believed. He, as every believer should see, saw joy in creation, joy in being, joy in knowledge, joy in love, joy in beauty, and above all, joy in that which sanctifies and ennobles and immortalizes these, joy in the cross of Jesus Christ." The reason why these men, including Jesus, carried their crosses with so much joy and laughter was because they believed and they hoped in the resurrection. Christ knew that his suffering wasn't the end, and the same goes for St. Thomas More and Pope John Paul I. These men had pure joy and hope in the promise Christ makes of the world to come, the world that we're living for. There's no reason to doubt that promise. Christ's resurrection proves that promise. That's where the joy of these men came from. And even more, they were happy to take on the suffering, and they embraced it because they knew what would be coming. I'm not trying to say that suffering is easy. It isn't easy for anyone. It wasn't even easy for Christ. But suffering is inevitable. It's part of our lives, and it always will be because we're not united with God in heaven yet. This book, published in the late 1970s, said the mood of Christian joy was under trauma or paralysis. But when I read it, I felt like it was talking to us today. Pope John Paul I was a breath of fresh air because he exemplified the joy of Christ crucified in a world full of suffering. Friends, that's how we need to be. We can't forget the joy of the resurrection when we are bearing our crosses. It's so easy to sulk in our pain and blame God for all our hurt, but what we actually need to do is give that hurt to God. Remember that we don't deserve anything from Him. Reflect on if we're causing that hurt ourselves. Find peace in the fact that we need a cross in order to have a resurrection, and hope in God's promises. Hope is not lost, my friends, so let's renew our roles of embodying the joy of Christ crucified.